Don't touch me. The command didn't echo. The gallery acoustics were too perfect for that. It just hung there, suspended in the chilled air like the dust motes caught in the track lighting. It was 2 a.m. in the meatpacking district, and the city outside was a muffled roar, irrelevant against the silence inside the glass walls of the Veritas Gallery. I stood 3 feet from her, my hand frozen in midair, the distance between us suddenly feeling like a canyon. I had come to this city to learn the art of curation from a master, to understand how to arrange beauty in a way that made people ache. I hadn't planned on being the one aching. I hadn't planned on finding the warmth beneath her marble exterior. The silence stretched, heavy and dangerous. Athena Vance didn't walk. She cut through space. She was a study in severe lines, sharp cheekbones, sharper eyes, and a reputation that could freeze a budding artist's career in its tracks. They called her the architect of cold. In the art world, where emotion usually ran messy and unchecked, Athena was a scalpel. She curated exhibitions that were clinically perfect, stripping away the excess until only the raw, uncomfortable truth remained. And I was her latest project. I was 24, fresh out of a master's program that valued theory over practice, and desperate to prove that I wasn't just another academic with soft hands. Working for Athena was less like a job and more like an induction into a secret high-pressure society of two. The gallery was our fortress. It was a cathedral of concrete and glass, perpetually kept at 68 degrees to preserve the oils and the tempers. The air always felt thin, pressurized, like the cabin of a plane right before the ears pop. It smelled of ozone, fresh paint, and the faint, bitter aroma of the espresso that fueled our existence. My days were measured in those espresso shots and the terrifying cadence of her heels on the polished floor. She drank her coffee black, scalding hot, and she expected me to have it ready the second she walked through the double glass doors at 8 a.m. sharp. I learned to read the micro-expressions on her face better than I read any textbook. A slight tightening of her jaw meant the lighting in the west wing was off by a fraction of a lumen. A tap of her pen against her tablet meant the press release was too sentimental. She dismantled my ideas with a terrifying efficiency. Sentimental, she would say, her voice low and smooth, is a crutch for the weak. We want visceral. She would tear apart my draft layouts, moving walls and sightlines until the flow was inevitable, suffocatingly perfect. It was brutal, but it was intoxicating. Watching her work was like watching a storm contained in a bottle. I found myself craving her criticism because it was the only time she really looked at me. When she focused that laser intensity on my work, I felt seen, flayed open, and rebuilt. There was an intimacy in the violence of her mentorship. We spent 12, sometimes 14 hours a day together, breathing the same recycled air, smelling the same sharp scent of lilies and the expensive, woody perfume she wore that clung to her blazers, a scent that started to haunt my apartment, even when I went home. The tension wasn't obvious at first. It lived in the subtext, in the pauses between instructions. It was in the way she would stand just a little too close behind me while I adjusted a placard, her breath ghosting over the back of my neck as she inspected the kerning. It was professional, technically, but my body didn't react professionally. My pulse would jump, a traitorous staccato against my ribs, whenever her shadow fell over my desk. As the retrospective loomed, the pressure mounted, and the air in the gallery got harder and harder to breathe. A week before the opening, time didn't just blur, it liquefied. We were living in the gallery, subsisting on takeout containers that piled up in the back office, and the adrenaline of impending disaster. It was 2 a.m. when the walls finally started to close in. The retrospective was a beast of a show, spanning 4 decades of a reclusive sculptor's work, and we were behind. The silence of the city outside was heavy, pressing against the glass, but inside, the air was vibrating with the hum of the track lighting and our own exhaustion. I was wrestling with the void, a kinetic sculpture that refused to hang straight. It was a temperamental piece, a massive, suspended ring of oxidized iron that had to float exactly 4 feet off the ground. If it was off by an inch, it looked clumsy. And right now, it looked clumsy. I was on the ladder, my arms aching, sweat prickling at my hairline. I adjusted the wire again, still crooked. Stop! Athena's voice came from below, not sharp this time, just tired. You're overcorrecting. I looked down. She had discarded her blazer hours ago. She was in a silk blouse with the sleeves rolled up, a glass of Sancerre in one hand. The only concession she made to the lateness of the hour. She set the glass down on a crate, the click echoing in the empty room. Come down, she said. Let me. I climbed down, my legs shaking slightly from fatigue. She took my place, stepping in close to the wire mechanism on the floor anchor. She smelled of white wine, dust, and that expensive wood smoke perfume, but underneath it, there was the scent of warm skin and stress. It was intoxicating. The gallery felt too small for the two of us. She knelt, her fingers working the tension cable with that terrifying precision she applied to everything. I stood over her, watching the curve of her neck, the way a stray lock of dark hair fell forward, escaping her severe bun. She was muttering to herself, calculations or curses, I couldn't tell. The air shifted. It grew heavy, charged with the static of the storm brewing between us. Hold this, she instructed, not looking up. She pointed to the counterweight, reached out. The iron ring swayed, metal groaning softly. It swung toward her. Instinct took over. I didn't grab the weight. I reached for the wire she was holding to stabilize the swing. My hand clamped over hers. The contact was sudden, a shock of heat in the climate-controlled chill. My palm against the back of her hand, my fingers curling around hers. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. The sculpture settled. The hum of the lights seemed to roar. I could feel the fine bones of her hand beneath my skin, the pulse beating at her wrist, fast, erratic. It wasn't the pulse of a machine. It was the pulse of a woman who was afraid. She froze. Her shoulders went rigid. She didn't pull away this time, she simply stopped breathing. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I should have let go. I knew I should have let go, but I didn't. I tightened my grip, just a fraction. A silent question asked in the language of skin and pressure. Then she spoke, her voice barely a whisper, strained and low. Don't touch me. She turned her head slowly, looking up at me. Her eyes were wide, dark pupils swallowing the iris. There was no anger there. There was no professional reprimand. There was panic, raw, naked, panic. It clouds the judgment, she finished, the words tumbling out like a confession. It wasn't a rejection. A rejection would have been, you're crossing a line. This was an admission. She wasn't afraid of me. She was afraid of what happened to her clarity when I was this close. She was afraid of the fog. I pulled my hand back slowly, the absence of her warmth leaving a physical ache in my palm. Sorry, I whispered, though we both knew I wasn't. She stood up, smoothing her silk blouse with trembling hands, refusing to meet my eyes again. She picked up her wine glass, downed the rest of it in one uncharacteristic gulp, and turned away. Fix the wire, she said to the wall. I'll be in the office. The door clicked shut behind her, but the air where she had stood remained charged, vibrating with the truth she had just handed me. The next morning, the gallery wasn't just cold. It was absolute zero. Athena had rebuilt the fortress overnight, brick by icy brick, sealing the cracks I had glimpsed with a mortar of aggressive indifference. When I walked in, placing her coffee on the corner of her desk, black, scalding, exact, she didn't look up from her tablet. The air around her was a vacuum. Leave the door open, she said as I turned to go. Her voice was flat, stripped of everything. No irritation, no fatigue, and certainly no heat. It was the voice of a machine. She was performing the role of the mentor, but for the first time, it felt like a bad rehearsal. I spent the next 3 days living in the vacuum she created. I analyzed that moment on the ladder like it was a crime scene, replaying the tape of her panic over and over. It clouds the judgment. That was the tell. That was the loose thread in the tapestry. If I were just an eye, annoyance? Just a clumsy assistant overstepping professional boundaries, she would have reprimanded me with that terrifying wit of hers. She would have made me feel small. But she hadn't tried to make me small. She had tried to make herself safe. You don't fear the judgment of a subordinate unless they hold some kind of power over you. She wasn't trying to keep me in line. She was trying to keep herself from falling apart. We stopped talking. The verbal critiques that used to be our primary language, the sharp, rapid-fire deconstruction of art and space, were replaced by a blizzard of neon yellow post-it notes and curt emails. My inbox pinged with subject lines that were aggressively sterile. Lighting adjustment, west wall, font size unacceptable, C attached. She moved through the gallery like a ghost, a phantom in a tailored suit, navigating the floor plan with a calculated choreography designed to keep exactly 6 feet of distance between our bodies at all times. If I entered the storage room, she would suddenly remember an urgent call in the office. If I went to the break room, she would be leaving it. It was a dance of avoidance, precise and exhausting. But glass walls are a double-edged sword. She had designed the main office to oversee the gallery floor, a panopticon that allowed her to monitor every sightline. But it meant I could see her too. From my desk, near the freight elevator, buried behind stacks of catalogs, I watched her when she thought she was alone. The unflinching precision the critics raved about was fraying at the edges. I saw her stare at a blank screen for 20 minutes, her hand hovering over the mouse, trembling just slightly, a tremor that had nothing to do with caffeine. I saw her press the heels of her hands into her eyes, rubbing away a headache that I knew was born of tension, not dehydration. She looked exhausted. Not the good kind of tired that comes from creating something beautiful, the satisfied ache of a job done well, but the desperate, hollowed-out exhaustion of someone holding a heavy door shut against a hurricane. She was fighting a war inside that glass box, and I was the enemy at the gates. She thought she was punishing me with the silence. She thought the distance would make me feel chastised, remind me of the hierarchy she clung to like a life raft. But it had the opposite effect. Every time she walked out of a room because I walked into it, she confirmed my hypothesis. She was terrified. And that fear gave me a strange, reckless confidence. I wasn't just the student anymore, scrambling for approval. I was the variable she couldn't control. I was the cloud in her judgment. I started leaving my own notes, not about work exactly, but about the subtext. On a layout for the sculpture garden, right next to her red ink correction, I wrote, "The flow here feels forced. It needs to breathe." I watched her read it through the glass. She paused, her pen hovering, and then she didn't cross it out. She just stared at it, her finger tracing the line of my handwriting. It couldn't last. The silence was unsustainable. The retrospective opening, the gala, was a freight train that wasn't going to stop for her emotional crisis. We had donors flying in from Zurich, critics sharpening their knives in New York, and a catered reception for 300 people to manage. The sheer logistics of the event were about to force the walls down. We could avoid each other in the quiet, but we couldn't hide in the chaos. The pressure was building, the barometer was dropping, and the storm was finally about to break the glass. The day of the gala, the gallery ceased to be a sanctuary. It became a battlefield. The silence I had grown to love, that heavy, expensive quiet, was violently evicted by the screech of packing tape and the chaotic shouting of the events team. The air, usually crisp and smelling of ozone, was now suffocatingly thick with the scent of 3,000 Casablanca lilies. It was a cloying, funeral home sweetness that coated the back of my throat. Everywhere I looked, there was movement, caterers clinking crystal flutes, lighting technicians yelling from lifts, investors wandering through with clipboards. It was sensory violence. Athena was in the center of it, wearing a black jumpsuit that looked like it had been cut from midnight sky, but she was fraying. I watched her from the periphery. She was micromanaging the placement of the hors d'oeuvres trays, her voice tight, vibrating with a frequency that set my teeth on edge. She was spiraling. The unflinching precision was gone, replaced by a frantic, brittle energy. She kept checking her watch, her fingers drumming a manic rhythm against her thigh. She was a woman who defined herself by control, and the sheer entropy of the event was dismantling her. She looked like a Stradivarius being used to hammer in a nail, beautiful, high tension, and about to snap. Then came the sound that stopped the room, a sickening, splintering crunch of wood against concrete from the loading bay. The noise cut through the chatter like a gunshot. The transport team had mishandled the crate containing the centerpiece. The Void's counterpart, a massive, precarious glass monolith. Panic detonated instantly. The foreman started shouting. The caterers froze. Athena stopped dead in the middle of the main hall. I saw the color drain from her face, leaving her looking as pale as the plaster walls. She didn't move toward the crisis. She swayed, just slightly, as if the gravity in the room had suddenly doubled. This was the nightmare. The show couldn't open without that piece. It was the anchor of the entire retrospective. And she was paralyzed. The architect of cold had frozen. I didn't look at her for permission. I dropped the guest list I was holding and sprinted toward the disaster. "Don't move it!" I yelled, my voice cutting through the shouting with an authority I didn't know I possessed. I was suddenly the one giving orders. I slid onto my knees on the concrete floor, assessing the damage. The crate was fractured, the internal bracing compromised, but the glass looked intact. It just needed stabilization before they could attempt the lift. "Get the ratchet straps!" I barked at the foreman, not even looking at him. "And the high-density foam. Now!" I took charge. I was on the ground, grease smearing my hands, shouting coordinates to the team. I directed the lift, improvising a brace with the packing materials, my mind working with a crystalline clarity that felt borrowed from her. I was channeling Athena, her voice, her standards, her absolute refusal to accept failure, but without the paralyzing fear that was currently holding her hostage. I wasn't the student anymore. I was the architect. It took 20 minutes of sweating, cursing, and heavy lifting. When the monolith finally stood secure on its plinth, unscathed and catching the light like a trapped star, the room collectively exhaled. The crisis had passed. I wiped the grime from my palms onto my pants, my good dress pants, and turned around. Athena was standing right there. She wasn't looking at the sculpture. She was looking at me. The terror was gone from her eyes, replaced by something far more dangerous: recognition. And beneath that, the hunger I had seen on the ladder, now unmasked and raw. She didn't see an assistant. She saw someone who could carry the weight she was buckling under. She saw an equal. "It's secure," I said, my chest heaving, the adrenaline crashing through my system. She took a step closer, invading my personal space for the first time in days. The scent of lilies was overwhelmed by her wood smoke perfume. "You saved it," she whispered. The distance between us, that carefully constructed wall of professional ice, had evaporated in the heat of the moment. We were standing in the wreckage, breathing hard, bound together by the disaster we'd averted. "I just did the job," I said. "No," she said, her voice dropping to that intimate register that made the hair on my arms stand up. "You did my job." The air crackled, charged with the electricity of a near miss and the undeniable reality that we were in this together. The storm wasn't coming. It was here. The silence that reclaimed the gallery wasn't peace. It was the deep breath before the plunge. The staff had vanished into the back corridors to change into their blacks, leaving the main floor in a state of suspended animation. We were alone again, but the dynamic had shifted. The hierarchy had been bruised. We retreated to the dressing suite, a sterile room divided by a vintage Japanese folding screen. It was a barrier of translucent rice paper, a flimsy wall for the weight of what we weren't saying. I stood on my side, fumbling with the buttons of my fresh shirt, my hands still shaking slightly from the adrenaline of the repair. On the other side, I heard the distinct, sibilant slide of a zipper, the soft pool of heavy fabric hitting the floor. The sounds were magnified in the small space. It was an auditory striptease that made my mouth go dry. I imagined the silk sliding over her shoulders, the line of her back. The tension I knew was living in the curve of her spine. The air felt thick, charged with the phantom warmth of her body just feet away. "You think I'm cruel." Her voice floated over the screen. It wasn't a question. It was devoid of the usual command. It sounded hollow, stripped of its armor. I paused, my fingers freezing on the top button. "I think you're exacting," I said carefully, staring at the silhouette moving behind the paper. "There's a difference." "Is there?" The rustle of fabric again, something metallic. She was stepping into the armor. Precision requires isolation, Alara. You can't see the whole picture if you're too close to the canvas. You can't curate if you're involved. I leaned against the wall, watching the shadow she cast against the rice paper. It was a blur of movement, graceful and terrifyingly human. Is that what I am? I asked, the boldness of the earlier hour lingering in my blood. An involvement? A long, agonizing pause. The air in the room seemed to contract, pulling tight around us. You are a variable, she said, her voice dropping lower, vibrating through the screen. I have built this career, this gallery, this life on constants, on controlling the light, the temperature, the narrative. I determine where the eye goes. I determine what people feel. I am the architect. I heard the click of a clasp, the sharp snap of a shoe strap. But when you're close, she continued, and the confession sounded like it was being dragged out of her chest, I lose the narrative. When you touched me on the ladder, the geometry fell apart. I didn't see the art, I just felt the heat, and I cannot afford to just feel the heat. That is how empires burn, or how they get forged, I countered, my voice steady despite the hammering in my ribs. You think invulnerability is the only way to be strong. You think if you let anyone in, the whole structure collapses. But that glass monolith out there, it's strong because it was tempered in fire. It's strong because it was held together. I didn't save it by standing back and critiquing it, Athena. I saved it by getting my hands dirty, by holding it up. Silence from her side. Then, the sound of a deep, shuddering breath. Weakness, she whispered, the word barely audible. It feels like weakness. It's not, I said, stepping closer to the screen. It's gravity. It's just gravity. The screen shifted. She stepped out. The air left my lungs. She was wearing a gown of liquid silver, a column of light that clung to her frame like a second skin. It was severe and breathtaking, a suit of armor disguised as evening wear. Her hair was pulled back so tight it looked painful, exposing the vulnerability of her neck. She looked like a queen walking to the guillotine. She refused to meet my eyes, adjusting a diamond cuff on her wrist with trembling fingers. She was the most powerful woman in the room, and she was terrified. Not of the critics, not of the donors, but of the space between us. Do I look, she started, her voice faltering. Unflinching, I finished for her. She finally looked up. Her eyes were dark, stormy seas crashing against the shore of her composure. She searched my face, looking for the judgment she feared and finding only the devotion she was trying to outrun. Then let's go, she said, her voice stealing over, the mask sliding back into place. The lions are hungry. The double doors swung open, and the sanctuary was instantly breached. The silence we had inhabited was violently replaced by the roar of the city's elite, a wall of sound composed of polite laughter, the clink of crystal, and the rustle of expensive fabrics. The gallery wasn't ours anymore. It belonged to them. The air, previously sterile and controlled, thickened instantly with the cloying scents of amber, musk, and the metallic tang of heavy jewelry. It smelled like money. It smelled like judgment. Athena released a breath she seemed to have been holding for hours, straightened her spine, and stepped into the light. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The woman who had trembled in the dressing room vanished. In her place stood the curator, a creature of ice and intellect, greeting the board members with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, but dazzled nonetheless. We separated immediately. It was the protocol. She was the sun, drawing the gravity of the room. I was the satellite, orbiting the perimeter, managing the chaos she couldn't see. But the separation was a lie. We were on opposite sides of the massive industrial space, separated by a sea of black tuxedos and cocktail dresses, yet the tether between us was pulled taut. I could feel where she was without looking. It was a magnetic anomaly in the room's atmosphere. Every time I turned my head, I caught her watching me. Her gaze wasn't the critical assessment of a mentor checking on an assistant. It was tactile. It felt like a hand on the small of my back, a thumb tracing the line of my jaw. It was heavy, possessive, and distracting. I found myself stumbling over standard pleasantries with a critic from the Times because I could feel the heat of her attention burning through the back of my blazer. The night wore on, a blur of canapes and critiques. Then the rhythm broke. I was near the bar when I saw the shift in her posture. She was cornered near the monolithic glass piece we had saved, trapped by Julian Thorne, a donor with deep pockets and wandering hands. He was standing too close, invading the sanitary 6-foot radius she required to function. He was leaning in, whispering something that made her rigid. I saw her hand tighten around her champagne flute, the knuckles turning white. She was trapped in the polite cage of patronage. She couldn't eviscerate him because he paid for the lights, but she was visibly recoiling, her unflinching mask cracking under the sheer discomfort of his proximity. I didn't think. I just moved. I cut through the crowd, my movements fluid, borrowing her sharpness. I didn't approach as a subordinate. I approached as a shield. "Mr. Thorne," I interrupted, sliding smoothly into the suffocating space between them. I didn't smile. I gave him the Athena stare, cool, detached, expecting compliance. "The Times photographer is asking for you specifically. They want a shot of the man who made the West Wing possible." It was a lie, but it was a precise one. Thorne blinked, his ego instantly engaged. He stepped back from her, the predator distracted by a shiny object. "Is that so?" "Immediately," I said, gesturing toward the press wall. "You shouldn't keep history waiting." He took the bait, wandering off toward the flashbulbs. I turned to Athena. She was breathing shallowly, the relief washing over her face so profoundly it looked like pain. But then the expression shifted. She looked at me, really looked at me, standing in the space where the threat had been. Her eyes were dark, dilated in the low light. It wasn't just gratitude, it was a terrifying, naked hunger. She looked at me like I was the only solid thing in a world of smoke. "You're learning," she murmured, her voice a low vibration that cut through the noise of the party. "I had a good teacher," I replied, holding her gaze until the air between us sparked. She didn't retreat. For a second, in the middle of the 300 people, we were the only two alive. Then, a board member called her name, and the moment shattered. But the signal had been sent. The performance was over. The reality was about to begin. The guests began to filter out, leaving only the silence and the crash. The heavy steel doors clicked shut, sealing the city out. The lock engaged with a finality that echoed through the cavernous space. The gallery was ours again, but it felt different now. It was a ruin of luxury. Empty champagne flutes sat like discarded jewels on the cocktail tables, and the air was thick with the stale, sweet scent of lilies that had begun to droop in the heat. The hum of the ventilation system returned, a low, steady thrum that underscored the sudden, violent absence of noise. Athena stood by the glass monolith we had saved. She had her back to me, staring at her reflection in the dark window, or perhaps at the city lights bleeding through it. Her posture was rigid, the silver gown shimmering like a containment field around a nuclear core. She looked like a statue that had been left behind by a retreating army. Beautiful, solitary, and infinitely tired. I walked toward her. The sound of my heels on the concrete was deliberate, a rhythm of approach that refused to be hesitant. I didn't stop at the respectful distance of a subordinate. I didn't stop at the polite distance of a colleague. I walked until I was standing inside the perimeter of her perfume, close enough to see the tension in her trapezius muscles, close enough to hear the shallow intake of her breath. "Go home, Alara," she said to the window. Her voice was brittle, glass about to shatter. "The show is over." "Is it?" I asked. I didn't move. She spun around, her eyes flashing with a desperate attempt at authority. "I am not asking. I am telling. You have a shift at 8. Leave." "No." The word hung in the air, simple and heavy. Athena blinked, the refusal short-circuiting her command structure. She wasn't used to no, she was used to compliance, to awe, to fear. "Excuse me?" she whispered, the ice creeping back into her tone. I'm not leaving, I said, my voice steady, grounded in the floor beneath my feet. And I'm not buying the mentor act anymore. You can't wear the armor when I've already seen the skin underneath, Athena. You are insubordinate, she snapped, stepping back, trying to put space between us, trying to rebuild the hierarchy. You are forgetting your place. I am the curator. You are the assistant. That is the geometry of this room. That is the only reason you are standing here. Is it? I took a step forward, closing the gap she had tried to open. Is that why you panicked on the ladder? Is that why you couldn't breathe when I touched you? Because of the geometry? It clouds the judgment, she cried out, the volume sudden and shocking in the empty room. I told you, it makes things imprecise. My judgment isn't clouded, I countered, my voice low, dropping to match the intimacy of the dark room. It's never been clearer. I see you. I don't see the architect of cold. I see a woman who is terrified that if she stops performing for 1 second, she'll disappear. I see a woman who wants to be touched, but has convinced herself it's fatal. She stared at me, her chest heaving, the silver dress rising and falling with her rapid breath. She looked cornered. She looked magnificent. You don't know what you're doing, she breathed, shaking her head. I know exactly what I'm doing, I said. I put my hands behind my back, clasping them together, a gesture of surrender and of challenge. I'm standing right here. I'm not touching you. I'm not breaking your rule. If you want the distance, Athena, keep it. If you want the ice, stay in it. I held her gaze, unflinching. I let the silence stretch, let it pull tight between us until it hummed like a high-tension wire. I waited. I forced her to look at the space between us and realize it was a choice, not a law. But I'm not the one who's afraid, I whispered. She looked at my hands, safe behind my back. She looked at my face. The war behind her eyes was terrible and beautiful. The precision she worshipped was crumbling, making way for something messy, something real. Slowly, agonizingly, she moved. She didn't retreat. She stepped forward. Her hand came up, trembling, drifting through the charged air like a leaf caught in an updraft. She reached across the divide, her fingers hovering, fighting years of instinct until she finally, desperately, chose to break her own law. Her fingertips grazed my jawline. It wasn't a tentative test of the waters. It was a landing. The contact was a shockwave that rattled the very foundation of the gallery. For weeks we had existed in a state of high-tension suspension, like a breath held too long, and her touch was the exhale. The barrier didn't just break. It evaporated. The "don't touch me" rule, which had stood between us like a pane of bulletproof glass, shattered into a million invisible pieces, leaving nothing but the raw, terrifying open air. Her hand was trembling against my skin, cool from the air conditioning, but burning with a latent heat that seared through me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I let her map the contour of my face with her thumb, watching her eyes track the movement as if she were studying a rare, fragile manuscript she was afraid to damage. The precision she worshipped was still there, but it had changed. It wasn't the clinical precision of a surgeon anymore. It was the desperate, reverent precision of a starving person finally touching bread. I thought, she started, her voice cracking, a sound so un-Athena that it made my chest ache. She stepped closer, her other hand coming up to grip the lapel of my blazer, anchoring herself to me. I thought if I let this happen, the walls would come down. I thought I would lose the line. The line was a cage, I whispered, reaching up to cover her hand with mine. This time she didn't pull away. She turned her hand over, interlacing her fingers with mine, gripping tight, bone against bone. You built a beautiful cage, Athena, but you can't live in it. She let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and then she eliminated the last inch of distance. She buried her face in the crook of my neck, her body collapsing against mine. The armor of the silver gown, the rigid posture, the terrifying reputation, it all fell away. She wasn't the architect of cold. She was just a woman who had been holding the weight of the world up with her bare hands for too long. I wrapped my arms around her, holding her tight, feeling the shuddering release of tension that ran through her frame. It wasn't about sex. It was about the profound, overwhelming relief of contact. It was the intimacy of being known, of being seen behind the curtain. We stood there in the center of the empty gallery, surrounded by millions of dollars of art, and the only thing that mattered was the heat of her skin against mine and the smell of her hair, wood smoke and expensive shampoo and something softer, something human. Eventually, the adrenaline that had sustained us through the gala and the confrontation began to bleed out, leaving a heavy, comfortable exhaustion in its wake. We didn't leave. We couldn't leave. The world outside felt too loud, too chaotic. Instead, we sank to the polished concrete floor, sitting beneath the looming shadow of the glass monolith we had saved. She kicked off her heels, discarding them with a careless flick of her ankle that would have scandalized the board members. We sat side by side, leaning against the plinth, our shoulders pressed together. The silence of the gallery was different now. It wasn't the pressurized silence of a vacuum. It was the companionable, settled silence of a library after closing. I wanted to, she admitted quietly, staring at the distortions of light in the glass sculpture. On the ladder, that night. I wanted to pull you down. Why didn't you? I asked, watching her profile. She looked younger in the dim light, the severe lines of her face softened by fatigue. Because I didn't know how to be this, she gestured vaguely between us. I know how to be a mentor. I know how to be a boss. I know how to be a genius. But this? Being messy? Needing? She shook her head. I didn't have a blueprint for that. I thought it would make me weak. I thought it would cloud the work. I reached out and pulled the pin from her hair. The dark mass of it tumbled down over her silver shoulders, messy and real. I ran my fingers through it, scratching lightly at her scalp, and she leaned into the touch with a hum of pure contentment. Look at the work, I said, nodding at the monolith. We saved it because we worked together, because we got close. The friction didn't break it, Athena. The friction created the heat necessary to forge it. You were terrified that feeling something would blind you, but I think it's the only way you can really see. She turned to look at me then, her eyes clear, the fog she feared nowhere to be found. She reached out, tracing the line of my mouth with a thumb that was no longer trembling. I see you, she whispered. I see you perfectly. And in the quiet dark of the gallery, that was all the art we needed. The sun didn't ask for permission to enter the Veritas Gallery. It simply reclaimed the space. I woke to the feeling of light pressing against my eyelids, a stark, blinding white that usually signaled the start of a grueling 14-hour shift. But this morning, the light felt different. It wasn't harsh. It was clarifying. I shifted, my back protesting against the polished concrete floor we had fallen asleep on, and realized I wasn't alone in the quiet. Athena was still asleep beside me, her head resting on her folded arm, the silver gown pooling around her like spilled mercury. The unflinching curator looked soft in the morning light, her guard completely down, the faint rhythm of her breathing the only sound in the cavernous room. I extricated myself carefully, not wanting to break the spell just yet. The gallery was a mess of the night before, empty crystal glasses, discarded programs, the ghost of 100 conversations hanging in the rafters. But it felt less like a ruin and more like a home after a party. I made my way to the kitchenette. The routine was muscle memory by now. Grind the beans, tamp the grounds, pull the shot. The machine hissed, a familiar, aggressive sound in the silence. But today, the anxiety that usually accompanied the ritual was gone. I wasn't making fuel for a machine. I was making coffee for a woman. When I returned, the aroma of dark roast, cutting through the stale scent of lilies, she was sitting up. She was blinking against the glare, running a hand through her tangled hair, pulling the pins out one by one. She looked at me, and for a split second, I braced for the reversion, for the mask to slam back into place, for the cold distance of the mentor to reassert itself. But she just smiled, It wasn't her press-ready smile, the one that looked like a weapon. It was small, tired, and dangerously real. Black, I said, handing her the cup. Scalding. Exact. She took it, her fingers brushing mine. A deliberate, lingering contact that sent a fresh wave of warmth through me. Thank you, she murmured, taking a sip and closing her eyes against the steam. She looked around the empty gallery, then back at me. We have a meeting with the board at 10. They'll want a post-mortem on the gala. We do, I agreed, sitting down next to her, close enough that our knees touched. And the cleanup crew is coming in 30 minutes. We look like we lost a fight. We won the fight, she said, leaning her head back against the plinth of the monolith we had saved. I want to look at the light for a minute before the noise starts. We sat there, drinking coffee in the wreckage of her perfect exhibition. The silence wasn't oppressive anymore. It was companionable. It was the silence of two people who didn't need to fill the air with noise to prove they existed. The hierarchy had dissolved into the morning sun. The next show, she said suddenly, her voice gaining a bit of its usual strength, though the edge was gone. The modernist landscape series. What about it? The layout. You said the flow in the West Wing felt forced. She turned to look at me, her eyes sharp but open. You said it needed to breathe. Show me. It was a small sentence, but it shifted the tectonic plates of our world. She wasn't testing me. She wasn't setting a trap to dismantle my logic. She was asking. She was trusting my vision not because I was her student, but because I was her partner in the design. I pulled out my phone, bringing up the schematics. If we remove the partition wall here, I pointed, my shoulder pressing comfortably against hers, and let the natural light hit the focal point, it changes the emotional weight of the room. It makes it vulnerable. It forces the viewer to engage without a barrier. Athena studied the screen, then looked at me. Vulnerability, she mused, testing the word like a new flavor she hadn't decided on yet. Risky. Essential, I corrected. Perfection is boring. Athena, the cracks are where the story is. Do it, she said. She stood up, smoothing the wrinkles in her silver gown with a newfound nonchalance. As she walked past me toward the office to prepare for the lions of the board, she didn't stride with that terrifying, isolated perfection. She moved with a fluid grace, and as she passed, she reached out and squeezed my arm, a casual, claiming gesture that said more than a contract ever could. It wasn't a command. It was an anchor. We proved that the cracks in the glass don't weaken the structure. They're how the light gets in. The fortress wasn't built to keep people out, but to protect what matters until it's strong enough to stand on its own. If you've ever broken a rule to find something real, subscribe for more stories.